Pete and Harriet Deison were enjoying a full life, being parents, grandparents, and partners in ministry when deep depression spiraled Harriet into a darkness that caused her to take her own life. Reverend Pete Deison is here today to share the story and the comfort that he received with visits from heaven. Good to have you with us today, sir.
Thank you.
And we've heard many reports about visits to heaven, but not a whole lot about visits from heaven. And so this story really begins with the unfortunate surroundings that, you know, your wife went through this deep depression and wound up taking her life. That must have been an awful, awful day.
It was a very difficult time. She had had a history in her family of depression from that. You know, there are different kinds of depression, but her grandmother had it, her father had it, and what have you. But she managed it most of her life. The doctors had given her good medication, and she managed it well. But right there at the end, she began to complain to me. She said, you know, these medicines aren't helping me as much as they used to, and it became a very rapid
Descent,
and she died. So,
wow. Now, as a minister, you work with Campus Crusade,
right,
now called Cru, successfully pastoring churches for many years. You've dealt with this, I'm sure, you know, the issues of grief and navigating grief throughout your course of ministry. But you know, you had to find your own way. What was that like?
Well, first of all, I had to work through, you know, the issues of her death, and God was very gracious in that. And the first thing that He helped me with was to realize that I could trust Him with the fact that that God is the one who allows people to have certain conditions in their life. He's sovereign, and I had to trust that sovereignty. And then I had to realize He's still good, and I had to trust Him with the goodness of it. And once I began to settle that, that's when I began to have some peace about her death, but that's what got me curious about her life, and the fact that, well, she's not really gone, she's just in another place. And so I went to a theological library, and I found a whole section of books on heaven, and I pulled off 50 different books, read every single one of them, and realized there's a lot here that the Christian world doesn't really ever talk too much about.
So what did you discover? What are some of the things that helped you through this ordeal?
Right, well, and let me say, as I was reading them, some dreams began to come to me, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But the what I discovered is the truth that heaven is actually a literal place. It's a real place. Jesus didn't say I go to prepare some ethereal, you know, drift in clouds type place. He said, no, I go to prepare a place for you. And the word is topos that He uses, which is topography, you know. And He has a body now. He ascended with a body. He's sitting in heaven on a real throne. So there's a real place. That was very helpful to think about. And then the continuity of life, that life continues. We still are who we are. We don't become something different. We don't become omniscient. We're not God, so we're still learning. My belief is we'll still study the Bible when we get to heaven, and I'm looking forward to that.
Now, Pete, these dreams that you started to have, what were they? What were they like, and what do they mean?
Well, the first thing I had to realize was that the dream that I had about her was so vivid. And I had never been much of a dreamer before, or at least that I remembered. And this was a dream that, to this day, you know, almost 4.5 years later, I can recount every single detail of it. And they started coming periodically at times when I was really seeking and searching the Lord. And those were extremely, you know, powerful, helpful things to me. One dream, for example, was I dreamed that we were in an old house that we used to live in when we first got married. And she came in the door and she handed me a vacuum cleaner, which was one of my old tasks, so to speak. And it was as if she was saying to me, Pete, it is now time for you to begin to get on with life. And the meaning of them just became very clear every time I thought about these dreams.
How many would you say? I mean, was it happening frequently for you, or just every now and then, or when something in your heart became heavy?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Since that time, I've had well over 100 dreams. I started writing them down, this stuff. But what really got my attention was the dreams made me aware of her presence in heaven. And I began to wonder, does she aware of me? Does she have can she hear me in any way and stuff? And it was about this time that a good friend of mine called me up and said, Pete, the doctors have told me that cancer has returned. It's pretty bad, and I have about a month to live. Would you do my funeral? And I said, yes, Mark, I will. And so I went down to the hospital to see him. And as I walked in the room, Mark had grown up in the same town in Dallas, and he knew Harriet. I said, Mark, I said, let's talk about a funeral. We did that. And I said, now I have a question for you. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, when you get to heaven, I want you to find Harriet. I want you to tell her how much I love her and miss her. And then tell her that I'm wondering if she's really aware of me down here, and can she hear me or whatever. I don't think she's allowed to tell me, but would you have her ask Jesus if he would tell me?
So a little game of phone tag there.
That's right. That's right. So, any rate, I did the funeral, and time went on, and literally within weeks, another friend called and said, "You remember my sister? That she's been battling cancer." Yes, I do. And I said, the doctor says she has about a month to 6 weeks to live. Would you do her funeral? I'm thinking, oh my goodness. So I went, and about this time, reading in the scriptures, I'm reading in Revelation where it speaks of how the saints in heaven pray. The prayers, the bowls of prayer that are under the altar and stuff, and it's mentioned 3 or 4 times about the saints' prayers. And I thought, wow, Harriet prayed for me every day on earth, so Lord, could she still be my prayer partner? And would you have her pray for this friend whose sister is dying, because I don't really know where her sister is spiritually. And so time went by, I did the funeral, and about 2 weeks after the funeral, this friend called me up. She said, Pete, I've got to tell you something. She said, last night I was crying over my sister's death, and she said, I had a dream. And she said, and Harriet came to see me in the dream. And she handed me a yellow piece of paper with some questions on it, and your name written at the bottom, as if I should come and talk to you about it. And she said she was so encouraging to me. And that was Harriet's spiritual gift, was encouragement. Well, I started smiling when she said that. I thought, wow, Lord, are you answering that prayer that I, was wanting to know? And I said, but I don't want to just assume. So could you give me another example? Well, 5 days later, another lady came in my office who we'd been praying for back during this time, and she'd had brain surgery. And it was very serious, but she came through very well. And I saw her, and I said, oh, I'm so glad to see you. I'm glad that you're doing better. And she said, yes, I am. And she said, and I'm so glad you asked me, because she said, I've been meaning to tell you. She said, I had this dream about Harriet. And I said, really? Well, I almost started to smile, because I was beginning to think, I think I know what she's going to tell me. And she said, I came up here to the church looking for you, or the pastors, and she said, I couldn't find anybody, so I went over into the sanctuary, sat down in the darkened sanctuary looking at the stained glass windows, and she said, the door opened and Harriet walked in. Walked up, sat down beside me and said, I'll listen to you, sweetheart, and just started encouraging me. Well, my grief went from like a 10 to a 4. I mean, just, wow, she's alive, she's answering prayers, the Lord's letting her,
encourage others,
encourage other people in these dreams. And so that's what convinced me, and people started saying, would you write about this? And I had one request. I said, well, Lord, if you want me to do this, would you give me some more examples? And 5 more people came and told me about dreams they'd had about Harriet.
Wow. Wow. We're going to talk some more with Pete Deison on another program, but to connect with Pete, you can go to Visits from Heaven, and here's a testimony or you can go to our website, as always, harvest-tv.com, for an easy way to link to Visits from Heaven. Still to come, Brian Bush with the latest news from Israel, but up next, Pastor Mark Lance with today's motivational message. We'll be right back.